Most men do not grasp the fundamental architecture of their own subjugation. They believe themselves free, yet they are ensnared in invisible cages, their bars forged from the very words they use to justify their existence. This incessant compulsion to explain, to rationalize, to convince others of your worth, your feelings, your very right to occupy space. It is not a sign of consideration. It is the primal shriek of the trapped beast. Carl Gustav Jung, bless his intricate mind, saw this as a disconnection from the self, a symptom of a soul adrift. But let us be more direct. It is a confession of impotence. Consider the man who feels compelled to detail every nuance of his mood, every rationale behind his choices, his absences. He believes he is being transparent, considerate. Foolishness. He is merely laying bare his vulnerabilities, inviting the wolves to feast. He seeks not understanding, but permission. Permission to exist, permission to feel, permission to be. This is not empathy. It is a desperate plea for validation from those whose judgment holds no true weight. It is the orphan child, forever seeking the absent parent's nod of approval. These are the environments, often familial, where the subjective experience is systematically disqualified. That's nonsense. You're exaggerating. There's no reason to feel that way. These are not lessons in emotional intelligence. They are the hammer blows that shatter the foundation of self-worth. The internalized decree is brutal. My existence is conditional. My feelings are only valid if sanctioned by the external gaze. This belief, once ingrained, becomes a self-imposed prison. The individual becomes a puppet, their strings pulled by the perceived approval or disapproval of others. When an adult compulsively explains themselves, they are not engaging in polite discourse. They are engaged in a primal, albeit unconscious, act of self-preservation. They fear abandonment, judgment, rejection. They operate under the delusion that if others comprehend their internal landscape, they will be spared the sting of criticism, the chill of distance, the finality of exclusion. It is a desperate gambit to control perception, to secure a fragile sense of belonging, a fleeting moment of emotional security. But the price is absolute, the forfeiture of one's own psychological autonomy. By fixating on external validation, the individual systematically neglects their internal authority. They cease to act from conviction, from a core understanding of their own truth. Instead, they act to justify. They no longer feel freely. They must meticulously rationalize their emotions to preempt negative judgment. The performance begins. They stop living for themselves and start living for an audience, an eternal theater where the spectators dictate the script, and the protagonist is merely a pawn. Jung saw this as an obstacle to individuation, the arduous ascent to becoming one's true self. The truth, however, is stark and unvarnished. As long as the compulsion to explain persists, there is no true freedom. Compulsive self-explanation is not a defense. It is a sophisticated form of submission. Each justification is a whispered confession. I can only exist if you permit it. This is an invitation not to healing, but to dismantle the very conditioning that renders you predictable, weak, and ultimately controllable. We will delve into why so many live shackled to this need, and what happens when they finally choose the potent, often terrifying, power of silence. When the constant demand for explanation ceases, a radical metamorphosis occurs. The psyche, once bowed before the altar of external approval, begins to straighten, adopting the posture of an unyielding internal authority. This transformation reshapes everything. Behind the need to explain lies something far more profound than mere politeness or a desire to be understood. It is a psychic wound, etched into the very core of identity. Jung grasped that this compulsion is not merely a habit. It is a symptom, a reflection of an ancient, unconscious belief that one's existence holds value only when reflected in the eyes of others. This wound forms early, often in childhood, within crucibles of emotional invalidation. When a child's subjective reality is consistently dismissed, "You're being dramatic, that's not why you're upset," you have no reason to feel that they internalize a devastating message. "What I feel is wrong. My inner world is illegitimate unless validated by the outside." Over time, a defense mechanism hardens. The child learns that by meticulously explaining their feelings, they might stave off punishment, neglect, or ridicule. Thus, a pattern is born, carried into adulthood, where every emotion, every decision, every attitude must be buttressed by a convincing argument, as if the right to feel or to be requires a legal defense. At the root of this wound lies the erosion of internal authority. The individual no longer perceives their own experience as inherently valid. They become tethered to the external gaze, dependent on it for confirmation of their reality. This fosters a state of psychological submission, where self-esteem is not cultivated from within, but is a mere reflection in the mirror of others' perceptions. It is crucial to understand that this dynamic operates largely beneath conscious awareness. Those trapped within this pattern often do not realize the extent to which they are constantly attempting to prove the reasonableness of their emotions, the logic of their decisions, the motives behind their actions. But behind every explanation lurks a hidden fear, the fear of being rejected for simply being oneself. Jung posited that every individual, at some juncture, must confront this inherited internal architecture. Until they do, they remain bound to the values, judgments, and expectations of others, often internalized from childhood authority figures, parents, teachers, priests. They become mere reflections of what others deem acceptable, not embodiments of their authentic selves. This compulsive self-explanation, therefore, is an act of profound self-abandonment. It is the betrayal of one's own truth to render it more palatable to the external world. It is precisely at this precipice that the true healing, the true forging, begins. The recognition that one no longer needs to solicit permission to exist, that one's emotions, however intense, contradictory, or unconventional, are valid in their own right. This awakening, however, is not without its agony. When the individual begins to silence the incessant need to justify, the resulting quietude is disconcerting. It exposes the void left by the absence of a consolidated internal authority. And it is here that Jung's foundational concept emerges, the construction of inner authority. The ensuing exploration will illuminate how this cornerstone of Jungian individuation can radically redefine one's place in the world. What does it truly mean to cultivate internal authority? And why is it the linchpin in severing the cycle of compulsive explanation? Compulsive self-explanation is not merely a defense mechanism. It is a continuous act of self-betrayal, a silent, often imperceptible, yet deeply corrosive betrayal. Carl Jung understood that every time an individual contorts their words to avoid displeasure, conceals their true emotions to maintain harmony, or suppresses their decisions to circumvent judgment, they are distancing themselves from their own core. They are, in essence, abandoning their truth. This internal betrayal unfolds not in a sudden, violent rupture, but gradually, subtly, day by day. It manifests when you force a laugh at something you don't find amusing to appear sociable, when you utter yes while your spirit screams no to avoid being labeled selfish, when you dismiss your sadness as mere tiredness because you fear being a burden, when you mask anger with a veneer of rationality, terrified of appearing immature. With each minor concession made in the name of acceptance, a fragment of the soul is left behind, a casualty of social performance. Jung identified this behavior as a direct symptom of the ego, severed from the self. The ego, which should function as a rational center of consciousness, devolves into a subservient instrument of external acceptance. It reconfigures itself, morphing into whatever image others desire. In this perpetual state of adaptation, the individual loses touch with their own inner compass. They cease to heed their intuition, disbelieve their own feelings, and question their most authentic motivations. Doubt supplants inner confidence. This process of self-abandonment is insidious because it is often socially rewarded. Those who adjust well, who articulate their justification seamlessly, who avoid conflict, who are easy to get along with, are frequently lauded. But beneath this facade of social grace often lies a profound emotional exhaustion. It is the weariness of those who live for others, to the point where they can no longer hear themselves. Jung asserted that this internal fragmentation is a primary catalyst for neurosis. When the ego drifts too far from the self, the symbolic nexus of psychic wholeness, symptoms emerge. Chronic anxiety, existential crises, pervasive feelings of emptiness, decision-making paralysis, and a crippling deficit in self-esteem. Why? Because the soul is crying out to be heard, but has been silenced in the relentless pursuit of social conformity. At its heart, this struggle grapples with a fundamental question. Whose life is it anyway? As long as you are perpetually seeking approval to feel, think, or act, your existence becomes a mere performance, a carefully edited version of your truth. You remain a character in someone else's narrative, never the author of your own epic. The sole path to break this cycle of self-betrayal lies in reclaiming your internal authority. It is the development of the capacity to stand by your truth, even when it is not understood, even when it causes discomfort, even when it defies expectations. This is the nascent stage of true individuation, the arduous journey toward wholeness, even if it means the inevitable disappointment of others. But how does one cultivate this inner authority? How do you shed the reliance on external understanding to affirm your very being? How do you embrace silence when pressured to explain? This is precisely where Jung's concept of individuation offers its profound insights, and it is here that we will delve deeper. For only when this authority is firmly established does silence cease to be an absence and transforms into an potent affirmation. For Carl Jung, authentic psychological freedom is not an external grant, nor is it found in the placation of others. It is forged internally, through the relentless cultivation of internal authority. This concept, central to his theory of individuation, signifies the individual's capacity to validate their own subjective experience without the crutch of external approval. It is the decisive moment when the question shifts from, "Will they understand what I feel?" to the unshakable assertion, "It does not matter if they understand. This is true for me." Internal authority stands in direct opposition to compulsive self-explanation. While the latter is rooted in insecurity, driven by the incessant need to justify every action to gain acceptance, the former springs from a deep-seated conviction that your truth requires no negotiation. This is not merely an intellectual shift, it is an existential one. The very axis of the psyche rotates, its center of gravity moving from the precarious periphery of external validation back to the unassailable core of the self, the locus of true being. However, this transition is fraught with challenge. It demands courage, for by ceasing to explain oneself, the individual directly confronts the primal fears of abandonment, judgment, and exclusion. Jung articulated that individuation necessitates traversing the desert of inner solitude, the moment when, for the first time, you hold a firm no without succumbing to guilt, when you refrain from justifying a change of mind, when you conclude a conversation without offering an explanation, not out of arrogance, but because you owe no one a justification for your existence. Developing this authority does not imply becoming insensible or withdrawn. On the contrary, it means you no longer need to beg for understanding. You offer your truth as a gift, not a plea for acceptance. Communication ceases to be a performance and becomes an authentic expression. The fundamental difference between speaking to be approved and speaking to be true. In practice, internal authority manifests in the subtle, yet powerful, gestures of daily life, in the silence held in the face of provocation, in the firm utterance of "that does not resonate with me," without the need for elaborate justification, in the refusal to engage in emotional games where constant self-defense is required. Above all, it resides in the capacity to endure the discomfort of not being understood, and yet to remain whole. Jung regarded this as a pivotal juncture in the psychological journey, the instant when the individual ceases to outsource their self-esteem and begins to recognize it as an intrinsic wellspring. This transition is symbolic and transformative, marking the severing of ties with the old, conditioned self, the one perpetually seeking to please, and the birth of a new self, rooted, autonomous, and whole. Yet, this newly established stance is rarely welcomed by the established order. The silence emanating from internal authority often disturbs. Those who previously profited from your insecurity begin to lose their leverage. Manipulators feel threatened. Relationships predicated on power dynamics start to unravel. And this, precisely, is why the cessation of self-explanation triggers a profound shift in everything. In the subsequent stage, we will delve into this transformative turning point. Why does silence wield such immense power? What becomes of your relationships when you refuse to perpetuate the charade of justification? Prepare yourself, for what follows may irrevocably alter your perception of the bonds you currently maintain. If what you're hearing resonates, you'll find profound value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow dissects Jung's core concepts, while Dialogues with the Unconscious provides a 30-day roadmap for their practical application. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Silence, when it springs from integrity rather than evasion, is one of the most potent forces within the human psyche. Jung perceived this with stark clarity. He viewed silence not as an absence of response, but as a palpable presence of authority. When an individual ceases to explain themselves compulsively, they are not merely avoiding conflict or terminating conversations. They are deactivating an entire system of psychological control that thrived on their insecurity. This specific form of silence is inherently unsettling. For those accustomed to your deference, your endless justifications, your self-corrections, the absence of explanation is perceived as rebellion. And, in a profound sense, it is. But not the petulant rebellion that screams for attention. It is a silent revolution, an implicit declaration. I owe no explanations to be who I am. Manipulative individuals who subsist on the doubt of others find their game rendered futile. Emotional manipulation requires discernible vulnerability, a palpable fear of misunderstanding, abandonment, or disappointing others. Manipulation thrives on reactivity. However, secure silence, born from internal authority, functions as an unyielding bulwark. It neither responds, nor justifies, nor dances to the tune of others. It simply is. And this steadfastness destabilizes any attempt at control. Furthermore, relationships that have historically depended on your submission, emotional, intellectual, or behavioral, begin to reveal their true nature. Fragile, one-sided, built on an inherent imbalance. When you stop explaining yourself, you dismantle the implicit pact of inferiority. You cease positioning yourself as someone desperately seeking acceptance, and begin to inhabit the space of one who already possesses self-acceptance. This fundamental shift alters everything. Some individuals will inevitably distance themselves. This is not a sign of failure, but of realignment. Your silence begins to function as a filter, revealing who stood by you out of genuine affinity and who was merely present due to your perceived malleability. Jung observed that the process of individuation frequently necessitates rupture. This distancing is not punishment, it is liberation. By refusing to justify your presence, your boundaries, or your choices, you naturally attract relationships grounded in mutual respect, not in fear or dependency. However, you must be prepared. As you cease explaining yourself, you will also confront your own internal anxieties. The part of you that, for decades, was conditioned to believe that value is contingent on being understood will resist. It will implore you to reconsider, to offer just this once an explanation. It is in these moments that silence transforms into a spiritual exercise, a conscious act of maintaining wholeness amidst discomfort. Silence, therefore, is not merely the absence of words. It is the affirmation of being. It is the refusal to put your identity on trial. And the more you sustain this silence, the more it solidifies into presence, a presence that emanates authority, commands respect without raising its voice, and establishes boundaries without recourse to confrontation. It is a presence that requires no external validation to exist. But the impact of silence extends beyond interpersonal dynamics. It initiates a profound internal process, integration. When you stop justifying yourself, you begin to listen to yourself. When you cease rationalizing your emotions, you start to feel them fully. And it is within this space that true transformation ignites. For external silence creates the void necessary for internal listening. In the subsequent and final segment, we will explore this pivotal turning point. How the authority you gain in the external world actually originates from an internal movement. The return to your own psychological integrity. You will understand why integrated individuals do not seek to convince, they communicate. And why, when you adopt this posture, the world inexplicably begins to treat you with a different regard. There is an undeniable magnetism about a person who feels no need to explain themselves, a quality that cannot be feigned or coerced. It stems from psychological integrity, the state of an individual who no longer compromises their essence to conform to external expectations. Jung recognized this integrity as one of the most mature expressions of individuation. When the individual not only understands their truth, but upholds it without hesitation, without guilt, and crucially, without the need for validation. An integrated person does not plead to be understood. They communicate. They express. But they do not convince. because they do not operate from the premise that their existence requires justification. Their words emanate from a solid core, not from a concealed deficit. This distinction fundamentally alters how they are perceived. The world accords greater respect to those who afford themselves respect. And self-respect commences with a refusal to negotiate the essential elements of one's being. Psychological integrity is not synonymous with rigidity. It signifies coherence. It is the capacity to maintain an unwavering internal line of truth, even under duress. It is feeling something unsettling in a situation, and even without a rational explanation readily available, trusting your intuition. You need not present evidence or construct elaborate arguments. You simply state, "This does not resonate with me," and that is sufficient. This stance, seemingly simple, is revolutionary in a world where most live disconnected from themselves, where decisions are dictated by the opinions of others, where feelings are suppressed for fear of appearing overly sensitive, and where boundaries are breached with forced smiles to avoid seeming difficult. Integrity is the antithesis of this. It is the art of being whole, of refusing to fragment oneself for the sake of pleasing, of not hiding to avoid conflict. Jung understood that true transformation is not achieved through the accumulation of theories, but through the embodiment of a new disposition toward life. And this disposition begins with a resolute refusal to justify oneself. Because every compulsive justification carries a veiled insecurity. Am I enough? The integrated individual no longer poses this question. They know they are enough, even when the world insists otherwise. And herein lies the paradox. The less you seek approval, the more respect you command. Because integrity possesses weight, density, and presence. Thus, without uttering a word, a centered individual can subtly shift the dynamics of an environment. They have nothing to prove. Their internal coherence communicates everything. Such individuals do not beg for space, they occupy it. They do not react from insecurity, they act from alignment. But there is a critical detail. This integrity is only attainable when you cease betraying yourself, when you stop molding yourself for acceptance, when you grant yourself permission to feel, choose, and act, even if no one understands. This requires practice, presence, and self-knowledge. Above all, it demands the courage to assume responsibility for your own existence, without blaming others, without outsourcing your inherent value. And when this integrity takes root, the effects are profound. Relationships transform. Your professional positioning evolves. Your self-perception sharpens. Anxiety diminishes. The compulsion to control others' opinions dissipates. Because you cease living to be understood and begin living to be true. But there is something even deeper at play. Something that transpires not only in your interactions with the world, but in the very energy you begin to emanate. When you stop explaining yourself, you begin to exude a new frequency, that of someone in command of themselves. This energy is unconsciously perceived by all those around you. This is where the invisible shift occurs. The world begins to treat you as someone who does not negotiate. In the final part, we will explore how this psychological integrity reshapes your relationship with the external world. How, without uttering a word, you attain a level of respect previously deemed unattainable. And why, when you cease explaining yourself, the entire world recalibrates its response to your presence. When a person stops explaining themselves, everything changes, not merely internally, but in the world around them. It is as if a new frequency begins to radiate. You no longer utter, "Please understand me." Instead, you emanate, "I know who I am, and I do not require your permission." and the world inevitably responds. Jung understood that the human psyche is guided by energy, by presence, by internal structure, not by rational justifications. The individual who perpetually seeks understanding emits a vibration of submission, of doubt. The one who no longer explains themselves radiates strength, clarity, and authority. This is not about cultivating arrogance. It is about finally achieving wholeness. People begin to listen to you differently. Unbalanced relationships lose their rationale. Dynamics where you were submissive, predictable, easily manipulated simply collapse, not because you fought back, but because you are no longer available to play the same role. Silence reconfigures your relationships because it communicates what you once begged for. It states, "I am not here to be shaped, I am here to be." From this vantage point, you begin to attract a different caliber of connection. Deeper, more honest, more aligned with the person you have become. Respect originates from within, and the initial step is precisely to cease justifying your own existence. Yet, this journey demands presence, because in moments of doubt, the impulse to explain yourself will resurface. It will seem safer to appease. It will appear easier to yield. And it is in those precise moments that you must remember. Every time you silence an explanation, you reaffirm yourself. You consolidate your integrity. You claim your rightful place in the world, not as someone begging for space, but as someone who inherently belongs. So now tell me in the comments, what is the explanation you find yourself repeating most often? The one you know deep down you no longer wish to give? Perhaps it concerns your emotions, your boundaries, your fundamental way of being. Write it down. This is more than a mere vent. It is a turning point. And if this message has challenged or inspired you, do not keep it to yourself. Like the video, share it with those who explain themselves excessively, and subscribe to the channel. The next video is equally essential on this journey. Watch it now. You will understand why.